Chartered Accountants Association. I, CA Mukul Shringeri, member of Indirect Tax Committee of KSCAA, welcome you all to this webinar on the topic GST issues unresolved in supply, valuation and input tax credit. I also welcome CA Jatin Christopher, who is the expert speaker of this webinar, and CA Subramania BL, who shall be the moderator for today's session. KSCAA has created a professional development fund during initial days to conduct professional developmental activities. Many of the senior chartered accountants have contributed towards the professional development fund. Today's webinar program is in the name of late CA Shanmukaya and late CA Pandurang. Both are past presidents of KSCAA. Participants are requested to raise their doubts or questions in the question and answer tab available on the left portion of the webinar screen. CA Subramanya shall collate the questions related to each subtopic and raise the same to the speaker at the end of that subtopic for speaker's response. Remaining questions, if any, shall be taken up at the end of the presentation. I also like to draw the attention of attendees to KSCAA's Food for Needy during CA COVID-19 initiative. On account of generous contribution by its members and attendees, KSCAA has been able to provide for 18,000 meals so far, and we further request today's participants to contribute generously towards this initiative. Attendees may visit www.kscaa.org to make their monetary contributions. I take this opportunity to provide an introduction to our speaker, CA Jatin Christopher. CA Jatin Christopher is a chartered accountant, cost accountant, and a law graduate. He qualified in the year 1996 and specializes in indirect tax laws. He is a resource person for the Institute in its various post-qualification programs on indirect taxation. He has contributed towards publication of educational and research material by ICAI on various indirect tax topics. He is also a resource person for ICAI and government in conducting training for practitioners, trade bodies and officers. He has been in practice since the year 2000 and specializes in advisory and litigation matters in indirect tax legislations. He is a partner in the firm JCSS, a full-service firm with presence across India. Now I request CA Jatin Christopher to please take over.
Good morning, friends, and thank you, Mukul. I thank organizers of this program for giving me this opportunity to come before our members and share some thoughts about some unresolved issues relating to supply, valuation and input tax credit. Clearly, it's not that I am arrogating to myself this opportunity to resolve those unresolved issues, but to discuss those unresolved issues so that I may be able to present some additional perspective for members to consider, and hopefully members will come up with the resolution in course of time, because we all have to deal with these unresolved issues, and we cannot obviously wait for any court to come up with an interpretation, because compliances are already due and to some extent even overdue. We are not going to go into reading the law and in this discussion, but we look at it from the other perspective when we look at issues, and then we will reflect on the provisions of law that we will need to concern ourselves with. We look at supply. A partner of a firm drawing remuneration from the firm, is it liable to GST or not? When you look at it from that point of view, many times in our mind there is a set of rules in Income Tax Act that lays down what is the extent to which a partner is entitled to draw remuneration, what headings can the partner draw remuneration from the firm, and between the partners whether it has to be uniform or it can be based on their mutual agreement, are all aspects that somehow come into our mind. The question that we have to consider is, to what extent are the dictates of income tax provisions relating to categorization of the remuneration having an impact in GST. As you know, we cannot comply with GST law in isolation of the treatment in other laws. Does it mean that the treatment in other laws will dictate the treatment in GST? Absolutely not. But what I would like to submit is the treatment in any law also requires the same facts to be furnished by the taxpayer. So when I enter into income tax law, I have made certain assertions. Assertions is like a statement I am making saying so and so is the fact. Alright, when I make certain factual assertions for purpose of income tax act, I cannot in the same breath deny those assertions in GST. So therefore friends, when we reach into other laws for the interpretation, what we are trying to do is only ensure uniformity of assertions about the facts. Now we will see what is the assertion in income tax as regards partners remuneration. First, the assertion made very clearly is that payment of remuneration to partner is not liable for TDS under 192 because 192 applies to salary. Salary is applicable when the relationship is of a master and a servant. Since the relationship between the partners or between the firm and the partner is not a master and a servant, see, these are all the facts that we are asserting and collecting. Therefore, a certain treatment avails in income tax. For example, the income, all forms of income received by the partner, whatever name it is called, is all treated as income from business or profession of the partner. It is not subject to TDS under 192, even if it is called salary to partner, and therefore some treatment will flow there. If income is already taxed, then 10(2)(a) exemption is there to that extent. Where it is not, where it is a deduction, then it is again taxed as income from business or profession, and so on and so forth. So when we take those factual assertions made in income tax and bring it into GST, what are we saying here? All payments made to a partner by a partnership firm is appropriation of profits. When there is an appropriation of profits, it is not a supply. Alright, because to appropriate profits, I don't have, it is not flowing from contract, but it is flowing from status. The status of a partner entitles him to remuneration. It is not a contract under which he is drawing this consideration. If, however, a partner of a firm is also the landlord of the premises where the firm is carrying out business, then the payment of rental to the partner is not in the capacity or in his status as a partner, but as per the contract as the landlord of the premises that he is collecting the rental. So therefore, let's look at vis-a-vis every payment that is made, is it based on contract or is it based on status to the partner? Therefore, we will come to know that even if a partner is called a person in the definition of person, even if a partnership firm is treated to be a person in the definition of person, between partner and the firm, they may be two different persons for purposes of GST, but merely being two different persons does not mean everything that takes place between them amounts to a supply. So therefore, remuneration drawn by a partner is not liable to GST, not because it is for any other reason, but it is not a supply. Looking at it between associations and clubs and their members, please examine the law. I know we have all looked at Calcutta Club's judgment of Supreme Court last October, but please also bear in mind the law has been exerting itself in building sufficient legislative provisions with a clear intention to impose tax on activities between a member and a club. or an association. Between a member or and an association, a member and his club or association, there is this principle of mutuality, but the law very clearly appears to be drafted with an intention to overcome this principle of mutuality. Whether they have successfully overcome or failed to overcome is a separate matter, but it is unmistakable that the law very clearly is drafted with a desire to overcome this principle of mutuality. We can look at the definition of person, we can look at the definition of business, we can look at schedule number 2, which talks about transactions between a member and the association. So please bear in mind, when we look at these elements in the law, we need to identify whether the intent is to impose tax or not. Now, what happens to Calcutta Club in the context of GST? There are again two views to say that yes, that principle that they have laid down should not be disturbed in GST, that interpretation will still continue. But we need to also keep in mind that the interpretation given in the context of in Calcutta Club was in the context of service tax and VAT. So therefore, can we rule out the possibility that department will now not enforce GST law, saying that Calcutta Club is not in the context of GST? Whether they will ultimately be correct or not is a separate aspect. Today, when as an association treasurer, you are supposed to comply with GST law, are you going to take a stand that Calcutta Club will equally apply in GST also? So therefore, the output tax which I could charge my members, collect it and deposit it, I will pass that opportunity. I will not charge any GST to my members. Since I am not charging GST, obviously input tax credit also I have to forego. I will forego that credit and I will await how this judgment will play itself out in the context of GST law. So please bear in mind, I want to bring up at this point this concept of the difference between the law of GST and the ethics of GST. The law of GST and the ethics of GST. Very often I find questions coming up from various quarters. People bring up this question and their unhappiness is over the fact that these provisions, some of the provisions which they are talking about, is not fair. How can it be fair? In supply, we will find those instances. In input credit, we will find far more number of such instances. How is it fair? Is it fair to impose such conditions? I would like to submit for members to consider. As we are all learning this new law together, let's at least sort out the reason for our dissatisfaction. Is our dissatisfaction with the equity of GST? Or is it with the law of GST? Do we expect to be satisfied if our expectations are built into the law, or the law is all right, but our interpretation of the law is not all right? If we can separate it, then at least we will see whether it is fair or unfair. Is there clarity in what the law wants to do? Whether it is fair or unfair is a matter of ethics. But is the law clear in what it is saying? It should not say such things. That is a separate matter. Please bear in mind. If this is what the law is saying, can we proceed to interpret the law and at least understand what is the department's perspective going to be, so that we can see how we will deal with this provision? Please bear this difference between the law of GST and the ethics behind this law as two separate aspects, so that every area of dissatisfaction we see through these two lenses and then decide if it is a matter of ethics that we are unhappy with the way this law has been put together, then that is the forum for addressing those grievances are elsewhere. But if it is about the law itself, there is something that is misinterpreted, then our forum becomes different as to how we will need to apply it. Now let's look at what is going on. There's an instance where someone said, a notice is issued to say that the taxable person has undertaken a supply. The notice very simply said, so and so transaction appears to have been carried out. This transaction is a supply, therefore you are liable to tax. Friends, please think about this allegation that is made. Is it sufficient to say that I have carried out a supply, therefore I am liable to tax, or is it incumbent on the revenue to say what type of supply I have made? Because as you know, supply has multiple definitions. In section 71A itself, there is three definition of supply, and we know that in section 19.3 there is a deemed fiction about what is supply. So therefore, please bear in mind whether it is sufficient for revenue to say so and so transaction is a supply, hence GST is payable. Many times we tend to think that it is our job as a person who has been served the notice to disprove the case of revenue. All that we will need to do is object to the allegations being made by revenue to establish whether that notice will survive or it will not survive. To be able to do this, friends, we will need to have a very deep appreciation of how this supply at all comes about, because GST, as you know, is not a tax on turnover. All gross receipts that a entity receives is not always a supply. There could be receipts that are not in the nature of supply. For example, dividend received is not a supply. For example, compensation received from an insurer is not a supply. So there can be a number of instances where there is money received which is not a supply. There can be instances where there are credits. For example, creditors written back. Creditors written back is an income in the way we account in the books of accounts. But is this a supply or not a supply? Certainly not a supply. Please also bear in mind, gone are the days where we can tell the tax authorities this area of inquiry into the books of accounts or the business of the registered person is beyond the reach of this law. For example, VAT authorities were not permitted to do deep inquiry into matters where service tax was already paid. The fact that we have discharged service tax and the service tax is applicable and therefore we have discharged the same generally has been used as a reason to resist any inquiry by VAT authorities in those areas. Similarly, for service tax, look, I have been paying VAT, therefore it is beyond your reach to go in and inquire deeply into whether that transaction ought to be subject to VAT or not, and therefore be subject to service tax. But GST has turns on the aspect that everything in the books, many things not in the books of accounts due to the limitations of the rules of accounting, comes within the jurisdiction of the tax officer in GST. They can ask any information relating to the business because we ourselves have made a positive assertion that it is also in the course or furtherance of business. What is in the course or furtherance of business? Whatever you say is in the course or furtherance of business becomes in the course or furtherance of business and therefore exposed to inquiry by department. What is it that we are doing in those areas? Please look at it from that point of view. What transactions are in business? What transactions are not in business? For example, once in a while I do certain things. Is it part of my business or not? I would tend to think that the question of whether it is business or not business cannot be administered again and again. The question of whether something is a business or not a business cannot be administered again and again. It has to be administered once in the lifetime of the entity to determine whether question that yes, it is business, therefore yes, it is liable to registration. And once I have got into this compliance with GST law, thereafter I cannot come and cherry pick and say, no, this creditors written back is not business. No, this land owned by the company which is given for joint development is not business because I am in the furniture business. and so on and so forth. But my memorandum does not permit me to do these activities, so how can it be my business, and so on, because the non-compliance in doing activities not permitted as per memorandum is a non-compliance with Companies Act and not a non-compliance under GST. So please bear in mind, we need to identify factual assertions made by us under other laws to see how it will have a bearing as far as GST is concerned. Another pressing question that comes up quite often is this aspect of liquidated damages. Why should we pay GST on liquidated damages? Slightly long explanation, but I would like members to kindly consider what is liquidated damages. As you know, everyone has a duty to perform the contract he has accepted to perform. Everyone has an obligation to perform the contract that he has accepted to perform. At the same time, the law does not deny that person a right to resile from that contract and not perform. Right to perform goes with it, takes with it the right to breach that contract also. As you know, breach has two consequences. Breach is basically a consequence where the remedy will be in the form of damages, or remedy will be in the form of specific performance. I want to add a third perspective to this. Members will be very familiar that either you perform the contract, when the specific performance remedy, obviously what will happen is a court will direct the non-performing party to go ahead and perform that contract. For example, a builder now decides to scrap the project and say that it is become so costly that it is no longer viable for me to perform it. If there is a specific relief remedy awarded to the home buyer, the court will direct the builder saying, whatever is the cost, please go ahead and you are directed to perform this contract and give that house to the buyer as originally contracted. That is specific performance. Alternatively, there will be damages awarded. When damages are awarded, what happens when damages are awarded? It means the quantum of damages is sufficiently bringing the non-defaulting party into the position of not being in default, not suffering the default. So what is damages? Restitution, to be put back in the same place where he would be had the breach not taken place. Please consider specific performance or damages. When there is specific performance or when there is damage, the aspect that we need to keep in mind is that the contract has not been terminated. Please bear in mind, the contract has not been terminated, the contract is still in existence. However, a third possibility can arise where the contract is terminated and then the court sits in judgment about what relief to award. When there is anything traveling outside the scope of a contract, either by remedy in tort or by remedy after termination of contract, supply will not exist in those cases. Supply will not exist in those cases. So therefore, when there is specific performance due to the compulsion of the court, the builder or whoever, the defaulting party will go ahead and perform the contract, and when he performs the contract, it will amount to the supply as per those terms of the contract. Whereas if the contract is still there and the damages are awarded, the contract exists and damages are awarded, what does it mean? It only means that those damages are liquidated damages, damages that do not go to the heart of the contract. That means damages are of such a nature that do not warrant repudiation of the contract. Why do we need to go into these aspects? Is because the nature of liquidated damages is where something out of the ordinary is taking place, and for breaches that are not fatal to the contract, there is some amount of relief that is being awarded. Therefore, liquidated damages will come within the scope of supply in GST. So please bear in mind, we need to identify what is the nature. Very often we tend to get carried away with Just the superficial use of words like liquidated damages, discount, incentive, so on and so forth. We'll come to discounts when we get into the aspect of valuation, but please keep in mind that we need to be very cautious how we are identifying these instances, whether it is taxable or not taxable. Quickly, I'll get you into a few more aspects. Take another example. Permanent transfer of intellectual property rights. Is it liable to GST? Permanent transfer, as you know, in schedule 2 we've been always looking at temporary transfer of intellectual property rights. Temporary transfer of intellectual property rights is a supply of service, therefore it is liable to GST. But the question is permanent transfer liable to GST or not? Friends, please recognize, if something in GST is not liable to tax, you need to know why and how. If something is not liable to GST, you need to know why and how. I will give you 4 scenarios where something will not be liable to tax. First, it is not a supply. 2, it is a supply but not included in the levy of tax, like alcoholic liquor fit for human consumption and those 5 petrochemical products. There are 4 cases I told you. First, it is not even a supply. For example, it can be a case of extinguishment of property. It could be transmission of property. In some other context, I think we've discussed what are those transactions that take place in business which is not a supply. Everything is not a supply. Many things are supply. Most business transactions get covered within supply, but still there are some transactions that is not supply also. So first case is where it is not a supply, then you know there is no incidence of GST. Next is where it is outside the scope of levy. Although it is a supply, it is outside the scope of levy because it is alcoholic liquor fit for human consumption and those 5 petrochemical products. The third is it is leviable, but there is a specific exemption to say that it is not taxable. Specific exemption under 11(1) is there to say that it is not taxable. And the fourth we need to keep in mind is it is a supply but by fiction treated as not a supply. That is third schedule. It is a supply. If it is not a supply, why will third schedule contain the word supply? So it is a supply, but it is treated as not being a supply. So whenever you have any transaction that is not subjected to GST, we need to ask ourselves, do we know which of these 4 ways it is covered so as not to come within the mischief of this law? If we don't know that, then we haven't analyzed exactly why we are not paying tax once we have established that it is already business. Let me give you a couple of more instances to look at what happens. As you know, immovable properties are sold by executing a sale deed. Immovable properties are sold by executing a sale deed. What if instead of executing a sale deed, a GPA, irrevocable GPA is issued so that the seller can take some money from the GPA holder and go on his way, and GPA holder is permitted to execute a valid sale deed in favor of a real buyer and retain the differential of the 2 considerations. So therefore in this case we come to know that a GPA holder is not a owner. A GPA holder is not a owner. Once he is not a owner, the net differential that he retains from both the transactions, I don't want to explain the facts in any more greater detail because members I'm sure understand what it is. The differential that this GPA holder retains is not towards sale of the property, it is basically the remuneration earned by the GPA holder as a GPA holder. So therefore that income is liable to GST. He may not do this very often, he may not do this with that intention. These aspects are not at all relevant. The original intention was to do this transaction as a sale, but it was given the form of GPA. Friends, When we look at taxation, this one principle I want to lay it out for members to very carefully consider. In taxation, there is no place for substance over form. In taxation, there is no place for substance over form. In taxation, it is always form that prevails over the substance, because if form is ignored, then tax authorities will run amok. They can introduce what they think could be the reason for doing the business. Tax law is interpreted based on what is done and not for the reason behind what is done. Tax law is always interpreted based on what is done and not the reason behind what is done. I'll give you two very old judgments for you to kindly consider. There was one instance, a estranged husband and wife, Thomas versus Thomas, very old judgment, where they said the husband promised the wife £100 allowance every month. The wife accepted that allowance, and she went back to England. Now what happened? After some time, he stopped paying that allowance, and she brought an action in a court to force him to pay that allowance. The court asked, what is the reason, what is the consideration for the husband, because there is no marital relationship any longer, what is the consideration for the husband to pay this £100? The court came to the conclusion that there is no consideration for the husband for agreeing to pay this £100. The wife claimed in the court, it is because he promised to pay this consideration, she has refrained from filing a suit for maintenance. The court said, we cannot enter into the mind of the husband to decide what may have been the reason for agreeing to pay this £100. From what is visible, we have to interpret. We cannot enter the mind of the party to discover what may have been their motivation for entering into such a contract. You will find many cases that sometimes the consideration is very shocking. Very high consideration is paid, or very negligible consideration is paid out of comparison with market rates. Even then, courts cannot step in unless there is any fraud or collusion or misrepresentation or any such thing that affects the validity of the contract. A court cannot come and say, I will tell you what should be the consideration. But you will find from your own experience, there is a tendency of tax authorities to read into the contract what they think was the intention of the parties. Such a thing is not at all possible. Another example that you can think of is Combe versus Combe, where the court said, we will not interpret what may have been the reasons for the parties to enter into the contract, but we will only read what reasonably explains the actions of the parties. What reasonably explains the actions of the parties, that is all that we will explain. So friends, please keep this in mind. Whenever you look at a contractual arrangement, please look at it based on the form of the transaction and not the substance of the transaction. I know as auditors it may be a challenge, because we are all used to investigating to figure out the substance of the transaction, because that is what we will need to disclose as far as accounts and audit is concerned, how we will need to report the substance of the transaction. When we are looking at non-compliance, when we are looking at violation of law, we will go into substance of the transaction, whether the company committed the offense attracting penalty, or is there a person in the company, a natural person in the company, who was the perpetrator of this offense. Please bear in mind, there are specific instances where we have to look at substance over form. For example, when we have to declare the fair state of affairs of the financials to all stakeholders, there we need to look at the substance of the over form. Where there is any violation of law, there we will look at substance over form, because justice should be done correctly, and not that some face who is used to perform this violation should not become the scapegoat. So please look at it from that point of view. While complying with tax law, what is the form given by the parties is going to be decisive rather than the substance that one can imagine may have taken place. So therefore, friends, when you are looking at supply, all I would like to bring your attention to is look at a key aspect of what is a contract. What is a contract? Because I believe contract lies at the heart of supply. If it is not a contract, then it cannot be a supply under 71A. 71B, 71C deal with other aspects. If it is not a contract, then it is not a supply under 71A. When you look at 71B dealing with imports, you understand how it takes place. When you look at 71C, it takes you to Schedule 1. Schedule 1 says, in these following four cases, whatever you may think is a supply or whatever you may think is not a supply as per the general definition of supply, if any of the following four cases take place, we will treat it to be a supply even if any of the ingredients of supply are missing. As you know, being a contract is a very significant requirement to be a supply. If you look at Schedule 1, you will find cases where one or the other ingredient of a supply is missing, one or the other ingredient of a contract is missing. For example, consideration, if it is missing, then we know that it is not a contract. But Schedule 1 says even if there is no consideration, it will be treated as a supply. Please don't use the expression, we should also not use the expression deemed supply. The law does not call it a deemed supply. It is a treatment only to say that it is a supply. So therefore, when any missing ingredients of supply are noticed, and it is only these four cases, then the missing ingredients will be furnished by Schedule 1 due to the fiction. So therefore, please look at it from that point of view. How do we recognize these transactions and where do we need to impose tax on this? When you look at a case of a gift, even yesterday there was a conversation where we are looking at, when I give a gift, if I reverse ITC, it is sufficient. What is the problem? Why should I pay GST? Please bear in mind, gift is not a contract, for the reason that the person who was promised the gift cannot enforce the promise against the proposed donor. The donee cannot enforce it. Why can he not enforce it? Because he has not suffered any loss. He has not been imperiled. There is no consideration flowing to the counterparty. You can also refer to Curry versus Misa, a very old judgment, English judgment, which talks about the one theory of consideration called benefit detriment theory. What is this theory? Benefit detriment theory. To one party there must be a benefit, to another party there must be a detriment, then it can be recognized as a consideration. Now if you look at it from that point of view, when a gift is being given, the donee receives the gift item, but the donor, what does he receive? Nothing. That is why under Transfer of Property Act section 122, a executed gift is enforceable, but an unexecuted gift is not enforceable. Before we wrap up this point on supply, I want to leave members with one example, because this gift aspect will anyway come to when we're discussing valuation and credits in more detail. I want to explain one illustration and come to a conclusion. I'll request Subramania to accumulate questions relating to supply so that we can cover those and then move into valuation. And as you're accumulating questions relating to supply, I'll leave you with one example. There was an instance where a person promised to transport a horse. There are two persons, A and B. B owns a horse. A promises B to transport the horse from one side of the river to the other side of the river. He asks him, how much will you charge for transporting my horse? A told B, I will charge 1 pound, 1 pound for transporting the horse. B agreed and they drove the horse onto the boat. A set out on the journey to cross the river and B had already reached the other side and he was awaiting. Now, midway as the boat was crossing the river, the horse got excited seeing water all around. He tried to do something and landed in the water. A could not save the horse. After some, after some time, the horse on its own came up to the surface, but it was not in a very good condition. A somehow managed to drag that horse to the other side of the river and handed over the horse to B in that condition. Now, when B looked at the horse, B found the horse in an unacceptable condition. A is asking for payment of £1, but B is asking A, you need to give me £1,000 because you killed my horse. The matter reached court. The matter reached court. Please consider you are in the position of a judge. You need to decide what needs to be done. What will you do? Will you ask B to give £1 to A, or will you ask A to give £999 to B? This question I will leave it for you to consider. The answers are quite straightforward. Everybody will have two answers. Everybody will have two answers. Reason is we need to examine, are we looking for the answer under the law of contract, or are we looking for the answer outside the law of contract? That is important. If we are looking for the answer under the law of contract, for having transported £1 is due, £1 needs to be given. Since the contract has been performed but with a fatality, the compensation to be paid cannot exceed the rewards from that contract. So £1 is to be paid, £1 damages to be recovered, therefore net nothing is to be paid. But if we say we are searching for the remedy outside the contract, that is called law of torts. Law of torts. That law says the compensation should be to such an extent that it provides sufficient restitution to B, and therefore you may award £999 from A to B. But please bear in mind, we are looking at supply. Contract lies at the heart of supply. If we can stick to interpreting all implications under the law of contract and not confuse with extra legislative remedies that we are familiar what courts are awarding, then we will not have much confusion interpreting what is a supply. Now I request Subramanian to please share what may be those questions, and I'll try to answer to my ability.
Yes, sir. Thanks for taking us through the levy-related provision. We have a few questions which are there. I would like to read out one after the other. So, first one is from Rahul, where the question is: in case of sale as a going concern or slump sale, is it a supply covered under the definition of CGST Act? Schedule 2 provides exemptions. Does it mean it is an exempted supply, and whether reversal of ITC on stock assets transferred to buyer is required?
Sale of business. See, commencement and closure of business is also a part of the business activity, you know, under section 217D. When I sell a business, as you know, Rule 41 very clearly provides for a mechanism for transfer of business as a going concern. In those cases, instead of imposing GST again, there is a mechanism laid down in the law to say that we will transfer this credit to the transferee under Rule 41. Now, if you look at paragraph 4C of second schedule, the law says it will be treated as a supply of services if it is not continued. If it is not continued, 4C has two clauses 1 and 2, where there is no continuation of the business, then it will attract all the incidents of GST. But where the business is transferred as a going concern, there will be no incidence of GST. Yes, it is a supply. Yes, it is a exempt supply. But before transfer of the business, all the credits would have already transitioned from the transferor to the transferee. So therefore, there is no treatment to be given under section 17(2) on account of this exempt supply. Therefore, you don't have any reversal required. Credit should transition from the transferor to the transferee properly.
So this is with respect to the credit that is there, sir. But the consideration that is coming out as a slump sale, that consideration would be considered as exempted supply based on the notification for exemption on services.
Yes, because exemption 12 or 17 contains paragraph 4(4)(a), 4(b)(2), which very clearly says that wherever you are having an exempt supply, you need to treat that exempt supply under section 17(2). So this consideration is an exempt supply for transfer of business, but there is no credit lying which needs any reversal on account of this exempt supply. There is a formula, exempt turnover by total turnover multiplied by 0. So therefore nothing to be reversed.
Would it not apply even for the credits that have been taken in that month, sir?
No. See, before transfer, before the transition date, on account of the transition, you have already transferred all the credit to the transferee under Rule 41. Therefore, the next day when you are doing that entry,
there is nothing remaining.
Credit is 0. Yes.
Okay. Next question.
Since we are on this point, just to caution, please be very careful when there is a reconstitution of the business from proprietor to partnership, partnership to company, or company A to company B. In those cases, please be very careful how you do this going concern transfer, because in reality, you know the old debtors will continue to give payments in the name of the old entity only and not the new entity. There may be some overlapping transactions. As you know, in Companies Act and income tax, you have to go back and redo the accounts once the transfer or the merger scheme is approved. But in GST, you will find that in section 85 very clearly it says whoever does the business while the scheme is under approval before NCLT or any authority, those transactions will continue to be taxed in the hands of the entities which have carried out those transactions. So please be very careful. GST does not follow what Income Tax and Companies Act required to be followed in such overlap in this interim period. Please be very careful about that.
Yes. Next question is from Suresh. What is the final position on taxability of financial credit notes received on account of turnover discounts? Also, how do we disclose it in 9 or 9C?
There is a long answer. Discount is a separate topic in the context of valuation. If you will permit me, I'll take up this discount in valuation so that we can cover a few scenarios as to how this needs to be dealt with.
Sure, sir. Next is from Mr. Dayanand. When business is sold as a going concern, despite of special provisions of section 18(3), is it required to reverse the common ITC due to exemption given under notification 12/2017? I think you have already
not required to reverse anything.
You have already addressed this. Next. Next is from Mr. Govind Raju. I think there is still no clarity on remuneration to directors regarding applicability of GST.
All right. Okay. Since there is no clarity, then I'll take it as a statement. But I'll share my views about it, what needs to be done, particularly Alpine Consulting, Karnataka AR, and Claycraft, Rajasthan AR, what needs to be done. In these two particular ARs, please be very careful. The facts, the way it is presented, will have a bearing on the interpretation given by the authority. If you give the facts correctly, not correctly, as if to say that the facts given were incorrect, the way facts are given, the interpretation will follow those facts. When we read a ruling, the first thing we have to examine is whether our facts are exactly equal to the facts in the application. If our facts are not the same, then there is no reason for us to be doubtful. If you look at this AR, Rajasthan AR, in paragraph number 5.3, paragraph number 5.3, what it has been recorded is the applicant has stated that there are two streams of payment flowing from the company to the director. One stream is commission on which company is already been paying RCM. They are paying to Mr. A commission on which company is already paying RCM. On the other hand, they are paying fixed monthly remuneration. The application is whether this fixed monthly remuneration is also liable to RCM or not. That was the question. But my struggle here is that there is a very fatal contradiction in the facts. There is a very fatal contradiction in the facts. If an employee is an employee legally, that means master servant relationship exists between the company and the director, and the salary paid to the servant is really salary. As you know, under section 17(2) of Income Tax Act, all payments made by the master to the servant is salary. How can there be such a contradiction that commission paid is not a salary, salary paid, a fixed amount paid alone is a salary? So I find that this is unusual fact pattern which majority companies may not have. So therefore, Claycraft ruling may not be relevant to most cases. That is one. If you look at Alpine Consulting, Karnataka AR, in paragraph 5, the authority has recorded the facts presented and says the director is not an employee of the company. That has been admitted by the applicant. Once the director is admittedly not an employee, there is no question of discussing whether it is a salary and therefore should be outside the purview of GST. Based on the facts, both these rulings have been rendered. The tendency I am seeing in some of the media reports, etc., is to take only that one sentence of the ruling and paste it in all contexts and create anxiety. I feel both these rulings are correct in their own facts. In their own factual matrix, these rulings are correct. But in majority of cases, a director who is having a master servant relationship, all forms, all names, all titles, all shape, all condition in which remuneration flows from the company to the director, unless the director is acting not in the capacity of director. Suppose a director is also raw material supplier. Purchase price for the raw material cannot be called director's remuneration. I am sure members are are experts to be able to discern in capacity of director what remuneration he is receiving. If that is the case, then clearly if there is a master servant relationship, there is no question of GST. If master servant relationship is absent, there is no question of exemption.
So the next question is on the cancellation charges. What is the implication of GST on cancellation charges received by travel agents?
Cancellation charges. All right. Now let's look at it. Cancellation is part of ticketing activity. It will happen always. It will always happen that way, that there will be cancellation charges. And when I book a ticket, I have paid the GST, subsequently the ticket is cancelled, the cancellation charges needs to be identified on what count this is taking place. When you look at each of these transactions, please examine what is the supply, what is the HS classification applicable to the supply. The law very clearly says commission received by ticketing agents has a separate valuation, separate rate of tax. Cancellation charges needs to be differentiated from other value added services. For example, a ticketing agent assists in visa processing. As you know, visa processing is an incidental activity in the ticketing agent business, but not necessarily linked to a ticket. Somebody may take the travel agent services for booking a ticket, but he need not go to the same travel agent for getting the visa done. Somebody may go to the travel agent to get the visa done, but there is no immediate plan to travel abroad, therefore no ticket need to be booked. So each transaction needs to be assessed on its own merit. Cancellation charges is not only for reversing the earlier booking, but this is a consideration specially charged in order to facilitate this cancellation. So therefore, cancellation will stand as a separate value added service apart from ticketing service. Therefore, this does not have any special rate of tax. 18% rate of tax will apply on this transaction.
Yes. Uh, Generally, some amounts will be received in excess from few customers. Happens in no,
Okay.
generally it happens in the case of two-wheeler and four-wheeler sales. So generally they park it in a particular ledger and they offer it to income. What would happen to the taxability of that excess income, sir? The excess amounts which are collected, which are forfeited, the sense is excess collected.
All right. Tax has to be paid to the extent the invoice has been raised. Now there is some money collected. Please examine the nature of this money collected and decision not to repay this money. Decision not to repay this money. When you look at this transaction, this excess money collected is not so much relevant as the assertion made on the fact that the customer will not come back to collect this money. So here we need to examine what is the implied contract in that forfeiture. Somebody says, I will give you 1,000 rupees and I don't want to collect this money back from you. What is the nature of that contract? The quick answer in my mind is that excess, since it is collected, is liable to tax. But I would encourage you to not to separate the two. When I sold the vehicle for 1,19,000 and the customer paid 1,20,000, the invoice was fully settled for 1,19,000. That 1,000 rupees, that is excess. What does this automobile dealer explain it as while treating it as an income? That will decide what the GST treatment will follow, because positive assertion on facts in income tax will also be used to arrive at a GST interpretation.
Okay. They just park it as excess amounts received from customers, sir.
No, that is the head of account, man. That is the head of account. But what is the contractual remedy? Is it something that is tomorrow to be repaid if the customer comes back?
Correct.
These are all contractually we will need to answer, and the answer to that will come. Maybe his experience has been that nobody comes back, or if he comes back in 1 out of 100 cases only they come back and he manages to repay them. In those kinds of instances, we have to collect the information to arrive at what is the positive assertion on facts here.
Next question is from Akshay. Is SB Bank and PPF interest a supply?
Savings bank account is not given for somebody who is not doing business. All right, current account will be given when you are doing business. So obviously, the positive assertion on facts that is available here is that it is not in the course or furtherance of business. PPF obviously is also a personal savings out of that exempt tax exempt that form. Those sources of information tell us that both are not in the course or furtherance of business.
Yes. So next question is on joint development. Is on the development of land. Is the landowner developing layout on his own by receiving advances from prospective buyers liable to GST? Does it amount to supply of land only or not?
Is it own land or joint development?
Own land.
Own land. So it is not a case of joint development.
Yeah.
So basically, I will make some additional assumptions about the facts. Owned land, development works undertaken out of advances received from customer,
yes,
and not out of own sources or loan sources. Advance from customer is used to develop the land. Agreements are entered into today with a promise to execute a sale deed in the future. Agreements entered into today is not a contract because the object of that agreement is a developed plot. Property that is not in existence cannot be the subject matter of a contract at present. Property not in existence cannot be the subject matter of a valid contract in present. Therefore, the agreement entered into today is nothing but merely a promise in present to enter into a contract in future. When is that future? The future is when the plot is developed and ready. Once we recognize this aspect, yes, there is an element of sale of land, but by the admission, positive assertions on facts made by the landowner today, it is very clear that there is a significant role that he plays in converting land into plot. There is a lot of difference both in the mind of the landowner as well as in the mind of the customer. It is with this awareness that both are coming together to enter into a contract for sale of the plot. Obviously, the customer will not accept the plot not conforming to the specifications made at the beginning. Therefore, the one-third abatement given is applicable even in this case to leave the plot sale out of the scope of taxation, and the two-thirds is towards the development carried out by the landowner to convert the land into plot. So I believe this is liable to 7.5% tax on two-thirds when there is a plot development undertaken by landowner on his own land. Okay. Without ITC.
Yeah. Next question. Supply between related person even without consideration is taxed. For example, partner allowing firm to use his immovable property for the purpose of business of the firm. Why is this? Is it to plug revenue leakage of revenue, fearing that consideration may flow in some other manner?
No. I'll give you some example. Kindly consider a partner giving his property for the firm to run the business. We have to examine how the treatment is given in the accounts, because the understanding of the parties is usually reflected in the accounts. Positive assertion on facts. If the partner has given his property to the firm for running the business, you will not find rent entries in the books. You will not find rent entries in the books because he is contributing building, another partner is bringing his skill, and so on. They are going to share the profits. But if on one hand we say that the partner is giving his property to the firm to run the business, and other hand rent entries are passed in the books, whether it is paid out or credited to his capital account, the factual assertion here is that where rent entries appear, then the property given is not in the capacity of partner but in the capacity of landlord. But where rent entries are not there, there is no supply by contributing the building for the collective use by all the partners in the firm to run the business and his premises. So please examine the facts. Accordingly, GST treatment will flow.
Yes, sir. I think questions, balance questions are pertaining to the other topics.
All right. Excellent. Now we'll continue with our discussion on valuation. Please keep in mind, section 15 lays down 3 express disqualification. It is not a qualification, it is a disqualification. What are the disqualification? Point number 1, there must be a price. What is a price? Price is the money value of the consideration. As you know, there are two forms of supply which do not have a money value of the consideration, namely barter, namely exchange. Barter is for movable property and services, exchange is only for immovable property. In a barter or an exchange, there is no money value of consideration. In all other 6 forms of supply, there is money value of consideration. So the first disqualification is, if there is no money value of consideration, that is price, then you cannot operate within subsection 1. Second, The parties must not be related. If you are a related person, there is a straight disqualification. All right, that is disqualification number 2. Number 3, price must be the sole consideration for the supply. See, many times we tend to discuss that when there are related parties, as you know, second proviso to rule 28 says between related parties and distinct persons, related parties, whatever is the value on the invoice will be accepted. That is what rule 28 is saying. But please bear in mind, there are interpretations going around. We will charge 1 rupee, 0 rupees for such a transaction. Anyway, there is rule 28 to come to our rescue. Department cannot question it. I have the following aspects to submit in this context. Point number 1, rule cannot run contrary to section. The rule, although it is seemingly beneficial, the rule cannot run contrary to section. So there is no bypassing the sole consideration criteria whether related parties are doing business or unrelated parties are doing business. That is first point. Second aspect to consider is when lack of any relationship is sufficient not to result in any investigation on valuation, then the third disqualification in section 15 would not be required at all. What I mean to say is, as you know, 3 disqualifications: price, unrelated party, sole consideration. If we say between unrelated parties, whatever you supply at, it should be unquestioned and accepted by the law, that is not the case. If that was the case, then only 2 disqualification would be sufficient. There should be a price, parties should be unrelated. That means if there are unrelated, then there is a presumption that the price is sole consideration. But the law does not say that. The law says price, unrelated party, and price must be the sole consideration, which means the law makes room for the possibility that even though parties are unrelated, price need not be the sole consideration. Why? Business runs in such a fashion that non-monetary consideration can be received even when unrelated persons are doing business with each other. Second aspect is, merely because they are related, they have to go and answer the valuation rules, but it is possible that the price adopted for unrelated party transactions can very well be the sole consideration. When related parties are also supplied goods or services at open market value, then there is no need for any valuation adjustment just because they are related. Every related party does not deserve adjustment in the valuation. They can be related yet transact at open market value, and that transaction value must stand accepted. There is no question of rejecting it all the time. There is only a presumption about disqualification when they are related. That presumption, please bear in mind, is a rebuttable presumption. So therefore, there are 3 disqualifications for us to consider in section 15.1. Every transaction needs to be examined. Does it suffer any one or more of those 3 disqualifications? Barter and exchange transaction always suffer the disqualification because they don't have a price. Related party transactions always suffer a disqualification because they are related. When there is a price, when parties are not related, then also they may suffer a disqualification if the price is not the sole consideration. Please bear in mind, the law does not say what is the monetary value of that extraneous consideration, add that to the valuation. The law does not allow us to go under what is called the cost construction method. The law in rule 27 very clearly says follow the open market value principle. So therefore, value by comparison is what is the remedy and not the cost construction method that we have to consider. Next point we will look at. As we have discussed earlier, contract lies at the heart of supply. Schedule 1 transaction we don't have to discuss in this context much, because even when there is no consideration, it is a supply. Therefore, that will not be a pertinent case to discuss in the context of valuation. We look at 71A only. If any other supply I am referring, we will specifically touch upon it. Otherwise, please assume that we are only talking about 71A supplies when we are in the rest of this discussion on valuation. Now, when there is a supply, as you know, consideration must flow from the customer to the supplier, recipient to the supplier. But as you also understand, section 231A as well as B leaves room for whether by the recipient or by any other person. If you go back and read it, you will find whether by the recipient or any other person. What does it mean? Somebody who is not the recipient can also pay the consideration. What is recipient? Recipient is defined as a person who is liable to pay the consideration. How do we harmonize this? On one hand, recipient is the one who pays the consideration. On other hand, the law says whether by the recipient or any other person. Clearly, this is not some new thing in GST law. It's a very well established principle in contract law. A stranger to a contract is not permitted to sue on the contract even if it is for his benefit. All right, you know this MC Chaco versus State Bank of Travancore. It goes all the way back to Tweedle versus Atkinson, old English judgment, to about on the concept of privity of contract. Who can sue on what contract? A person who is not a party to the contract does not have the right to sue on that contract. However, a stranger to a contract is permitted to contribute the consideration. A stranger to the contract is permitted to contribute the consideration. When you look at it from this point of view, a third party who is not the supplier, not the recipient, he can contribute to the consideration in some way. Please bear in mind, we need to examine whether the contribution by the third party is an independent supply or is it an additional consideration for the original supply. Is the consideration contributed by the third party an independent supply, or the consideration contributed by the third party is inextricably linked to the original supply? Why do we need to do this? To establish what is the nature of this contribution by this third party. Second point to look at is to test whether it is an independent supply or a dependent contribution. We need to examine what happens in case this third party did not contribute this. If the third party did not contribute this additional amount, what will happen? If the answer to this inquiry concludes that the supply itself would not have taken place, then it is an inextricably linked contribution. If the original supply would fail to be concluded, if this promise to pay this additional contribution were to be taken back, then we know it is inextricably linked and it is an additional consideration to the original supply. But if you say that the supply would have gone back, but some additional benefits attendant to this additional contribution would not have arisen, then we can say that that is an independent supply to be taxed on its own merits and not based on the original supply. Because see, when two parties come together, they need not always establish one relationship. They can establish multiple relationships. Like we saw in other cases, a partner can also be the landlord collecting rent. A partner can also be, a director can also be raw material supplier to the company. Like this, we have to examine the relationship established. A good way to test the relationship is looking at the written contract. Many times written contracts may not be available. Then looking at the implied contracts. The way to test implied contracts is to look at what will happen if this payment was not made. That becomes a question. The third aspect to look at is when any additional payment is made, please examine whether that additional payment is a enforceable payment or an unenforceable payment. What is enforceable? If you don't give it to me, I can go to a court and force you to give it to me. That is enforceable. Unenforceable is you offer to give it to me and now you have gone back on your offer. Can I go to court and enforce it against you? We'll go back and look at one judgment, Stilk versus Myrtle. Old English judgment. What happened in this case was there is a captain of a ship who had taken some workers on the ship, agreed a certain salary for them during the journey. He agreed to give them some salary for doing all the work to carry the ship and the load from one place to another place. Now, during the journey, the workers stopped work and they demanded extra payment. Now, the captain of the ship was unable to negotiate because in the middle of the sea, how can he now say, I will not pay, because the ship has to reach the destination? He agreed that he will pay the extra money. The ship reached the destination. At the destination, captain said, I will not pay this extra money. Matter went to court. The court was examining the facts in this case and said, to pay extra money to do what was originally agreed for a price, there is no consideration to the captain for making this extra payment. When there is no consideration, the agreement to pay the extra money is not a valid contract, therefore it cannot be enforced. So please look at it from this point of view. Enforceability is a very excellent test whether there is a supply here or not. Now, if this extra payment that is coming in from the third party, can we say it is enforceable? In the sense that if it is not paid, the original transaction itself will not take place. That needs to be examined on case-to-case basis. To examine a relevant case in this context, let me talk about discount. Someone had asked a question earlier about discount. I had requested to defer it till we come to that relevant point. Now we are at that relevant point about discount. Now, A supplied a vehicle to B. A is the manufacturer, B is the distributor. A has supplied the equipment to the vehicle to B. B has purchased the vehicle. There is a dealer price already agreed. Let us say the dealer price is 1 lakh rupees. Retail price is 1,25,000 rupees. The dealer is supposed to sell the vehicle. As you know, the dealer, once he has purchased it, can we say the vehicle still belongs to the manufacturer A? No. Once he has purchased it, the property belongs to the dealer B. Now B, in his own interest, will do all marketing activities. B will not do marketing for A. B will do marketing for himself. That is why there is enough room in the price differential that he has 25,000 rupees margin to incur his overheads and make some money in the process, and he will spend this money. Now please bear in mind, once the property is transferred, we cannot say that the B will not do the marketing. Now suppose B refuses to sell any stock. What A can do? A can cancel the dealership. A cannot force B to sell all the stock. If B tells A, sir, I want to sell, but the vehicle is not moving in the market, nobody wants to buy this model of vehicle, what do I do? What do you think A will do? A will not take back the vehicle. If A agrees to take back the vehicle, he agrees to take it back so that B does not terminate the contract with A. The reason for continuation of the contract should not be substituted for providing service to each other. This is not a case where B is an agent of A. Now, already there is a written contract that I will sell the vehicle to you for 1 lakh, and there is an instruction that you should not sell above 1,25,000 to the market. Now suppose the dealer, in order to push the sales, sells it for 1,20,000 rupees. Is it wrong? Not wrong. He sells it for 1,10,000 rupees. Is it wrong? Not wrong. Suppose he decides to sell it for 90,000 rupees. Is it wrong? That is also not wrong. Because as a owner of the inventory, B is at liberty to sell it at whatever price he likes. But somebody may ask, what is the reason he is selling for 90,000 rupees? Does it mean that he is financing the 10,000 rupees from his own pocket? It is a matter of investigation. As you remember earlier we discussed, nobody can enter the mind of the person to figure out the reason behind his activity. All that will be done is the interpretation of what he has done. He has sold for 90, therefore GST will be taxed only on that 90,000 rupees. Now the question arises, a discount given by the manufacturer to the dealer. Please bear in mind, discounts are not suddenly invented in the middle of the night. Discounts are well planned, well debated, board resolution may be passed, a committee may be formed of the board which will go into the marketing plans of the company, and so on and so forth, and a discounting scheme is agreed. Now a company who comes up with a discounting scheme, can they implement a scheme without the consent of the distributor? There is some place where we can find that the distributor consents. As long as the distributor is not losing money, he may not object to any discount. He may not object to any discount. So therefore, please identify section 15 very clearly talks about discount in two cases. I'll explain the discount provisions very quickly as follows. Discount is a discount only if it is in the invoice. Discount which is not in the invoice is prima facie not even a discount, point number one. Point number two, discount not in the invoice, discount not in the invoice can still be a discount if and only if it is a contingent discount known beforehand. Before the vehicle was given to the distributor, if there was already a discount known, but that discount was contingent on certain activities of the distributor, then it is still a discount known beforehand, but the discount is given is earned subsequent by the subsequent actions of the distributor. Now if you see section 15(3)(b) very clearly, it says discounts given subsequent to supply is also considered a discount if the following conditions are satisfied. Point number one, that the discount must be known and agreed before the original supply. Point number two, that discount must be given through a credit note under section 34. Point number three, the input tax credit corresponding to the discount must be reversed by the recipient of the supply. Please keep in mind the time limit to give a credit note is already fixed by section 34. This law is known before the supply itself, both by A and by B. Now neither A nor B can come and say, I will give a discount, but it is not according to section 34. I would think that there is only one discount that is not according to section 34, which will also be a discount. That discount is a stale discount. What is a stale discount? You understand what is a stale check? A check which has to be deposited within 3 months, if it is not deposited, that check will become stale. This is a credit note that is given that is not within time prescribed in section 34. If it is given after the time prescribed in section 34, then that is the only case where a subsequent discount will also be a discount according to me. That means first, discount is a discount only if it is in the invoice. Discount not in the invoice will still be a discount if it is a contingent discount known beforehand. Third situation, discount not in the invoice known before the supply but given as a stale credit note will also be a discount, but without the tax adjustment in this stale credit note situation. Now we come to what happens to a financial credit note. Friends, please bear in mind, when A agrees to do a task for a price, then A has to do that task and B has to pay the agreed price. After A does the task, B cannot come and say, I will pay only 90% of the payment. That is illegal. That is illegal. If A performs part of his work only, will it be accepted? No. Similarly, when B says, I will pay part of this money, then it is not acceptable. But however, when we look at financial credit notes, many times trade taxpayers are pretending. Please keep in mind, taxpayers are pretending, misleading auditors and tax consultants by giving information with an intention to maximize GST benefit or treatment. But you need to investigate what is the real truth of the matter. First, everybody knows that credit note must be given before next September. Isn't it? Everybody knows credit note must be given before next September. But why will somebody give a credit note after September and making it a stale credit note? We need to know in what situation we need to suspect the accused. Every time we cannot simply suspect the taxpayer, but if the taxpayer's actions seem to be counterintuitive, seem to be harmful for his own interest, please investigate further, because the inability to give the credit note within September is not always built into the system. System is always designed keeping the law in mind. Keeping all these factors in mind, whenever there is a financial credit note, there is enough reason to suspect. Please investigate whether it is a contingent discount issued belatedly. This may not happen always. There may be some exceptions. Next, when it is not a contingent discount, then it is not at all a discount, as we have discussed under 15.3. So therefore, financial credit notes, what happens in the case of financial credit notes? When I have purchased the vehicle for 1 lakh, later I am receiving a financial credit note for 5,000 rupees. What does it mean? Is this financial credit note enforceable? See, I have purchased for the vehicle for 1 lakh as a distributor from the OEM, and I have received a financial credit note for 5,000 rupees. Before receiving the credit note, did I know that I can enforce recovery of this 5,000? No. If I cannot enforce it, it is not a contract. When it is not a contract, you know it is a voluntary write down of the debtor balance by the OEM. It is a voluntary write down of the debtor balance. As I explained in Stilk versus Metals case, paying more for what was originally done or collecting less for what was originally agreed, both are unenforceable contracts. I want to invite your attention to two judgments. One is Pinel's case, where they said collecting 90 rupees instead of 100 rupees is not legally correct. This is the English judgment. But later another judgment came in the context of Fox versus Beer, where they said such things are permissible because getting 1 lakh rupees after 6 months is not a good alternative compared to getting 95,000 rupees right now. So therefore they said this is a good judgment. In Indian law, we have section 63 of contract law, which says a person who has to receive money, he can accept lesser money voluntarily. As you know, financial credit notes in 9 out of 10 cases, my friends, is not a credit note because there is no contingency attached with it. When a financial credit note is is issued, and you have examined 3 tests, I will share for members to consider. Financial credit notes administer 3 tests. First, is it a contingent discount that has become stale? Is it a contingent discount known before supply that has become stale? Examine that. If that is not the case, please find out, is it a unenforceable voluntary write down of the debtor balance? Is it a unenforceable voluntary write down of the debtor balance under section 63 of contract law? Because here it says, instead of getting 1 lakh after 6 months, better to get 95,000 rupees today. If on that principle under section 63 there is an unenforceable voluntary write down of the debtor balance, then the recipient of the original supply need to reverse pro rata credit. The third test to administer is, if this financial credit note is enforceable, it is enforceable, then examine when it is not a contingent discount, how it is still enforceable. If you look at it, you will find that it is in response to the recipient of the vehicle doing something for which this 5,000 rupees credit note is being given. If it is enforceable, then find out what should I do to get this 5,000. What if I don't do, will I not be eligible for this 5,000? If you investigate that, you will come to know that there is actually a cross supply. You have given the vehicle, I have promoted the vehicle before the BS6 guidelines are implemented. I will push the sales over and above so that I clear up your inventory. There is a cross supply. There should be an invoice going from the recipient back to the manufacturer instead of a financial credit note coming from the manufacturer back to the distributor. So please keep this in mind. When you receive financial credit note, don't simply accept whatever is being done. I will give you another clue how to look at it in the books of accounts. When the manufacturer gives a financial credit note, credit notes very often are not reduced from sales because the quarter for which they made the sale is already over. They cannot reduce this quarter sales because they have issued a credit note. In majority of the cases we have come across, financial credit note is treated as an expenditure in the books of the manufacturer and not a reduction from the sales. However, the distributor who receives the credit note is trying to reduce his purchases with the financial credit note value and not taking it to other income. Books of accounts, as you know, in section 34 of Evidence Act, is only a weak evidence, but it is nevertheless an evidence because innocently certain positive assertions of facts are being made in the books of accounts. The manufacturer has certain interpretation of this financial credit note. That is why he has taken it as an expenditure and not reduced the sales. Now the distributor, he does not want to reverse the credit, therefore he may be taking it as a reduction from purchase, reduction from the or as other income. When you look at books of accounts, you will find innocent positive assertions about the facts. Collect all these facts, then come to the conclusion, because many times bad debts are also called discount, cash discount. I have a policy of giving 2% cash discount. These are all rubbish statements. Please don't rely on this. These are all statements given by a person who has a motivation to prove his to show that he is innocent, but actually he is trying to create evidence to establish innocence, but not that there is already any innocence here. So please be very careful. Don't accept statements that it is a discount or it is a financial credit note blindly. I have given you 3 tests just for repetition. First test, is it a contingent discount that is become stale? That is first point to look at in a financial credit note. Then valid credit note, no credit reversal, full credit to recipient, no output tax payable anymore by anybody. Next, if it is enforceable, if it is unenforceable, then it is a voluntary write down of the debtor balance. Rule 37 treatment is a compulsory requirement. Point number 3, if it is enforceable, then it is a cross cancelling supply and not a reduction of the value of original supply. Keep that aspect in mind. Next, I want to come to one example. I think this first time I am sharing this example among members. One very interesting situation to look at is, when you're dealing with valuation, we have to come to consideration concept. As you know, price is the sole consideration. There was one scheme introduced. There was one nice scheme introduced. It is called in Chappell and Company versus Nestle Limited. You can refer this up. Chappell and Company versus Nestle Limited. What happened in this judgment was, there was an instance where a company said audio cassette of a very famous singer will be sold for £1. £1. A cassette of a very famous singer will be sold by this chocolate company. They said, we'll give this audio cassette for £1. The cassette was normally selling for much more price. But this company said, I will sell this audio cassette for £1. And anyway, because they are unrelated persons, they offered to pay tax on £1. The court was examining what is the consideration for giving the cassette, and they studied the scheme in this particular case and came to conclusion that somebody cannot simply take £1 and go and get a cassette of this famous singer. They said there was one more condition. It said you have to bring 4 empty Kit Kat wrappers. Nestle Kit Kat chocolate, the empty wrapper, you have to bring 4. So the consideration was £1 plus 4 empty Kit Kat wrapper. Now the court went to examine what is the purpose of this 4 empty wrapper. They examined that to get 4 empty wrapper, you have to spend £1 for 1 Kit Kat. 4 Kit Kat, £4. When they purchase the Kit Kat, they have paid the GST, the tax on the Kit Kat. But to get the cassette, they are compulsorily required to incur £1 per Kit Kat, incur on 4 Kit Kat, so therefore it is £4. Court ruled in this case the consideration for the cassette is £1 plus 4 Kit Kat packet of £1 each. Totally £5 is the consideration for this cassette. Friends, please bear in mind, consideration is a very well tested, fought, struggled, disputed, decided concept. GST law is standing on the shoulders of more than 100 years of court judgments made applicable in India also. We need to understand that India follows common law, English common law as a basic principle. I am not saying that all judgments from the English courts will directly apply in India. All English judgments will directly not apply in India. But many English judgments, whichever are in harmony with Indian law, have been adopted and approved by Indian courts. When we refer English judgments, you can take any English judgment and trace it to Indian judgments also, whether Curie versus Mesa or Stilk versus Myrtle, Tweedle versus Atkinson. I gave you the judgment of Chaco versus State Bank of Travancore. Examine all these Indian judgments. Next, in European VAT, let me share this also. In European VAT, before VAT came in Europe, English law was followed in Commonwealth countries. Europe followed civil law, European continental law or civil law. Common law principle and European continental civil law are different. We cannot take judgments from Germany and follow in India like we follow judgments from England or Australia and follow in India, because Commonwealth countries followed English common law. That is first premise. Second point to consider, when European VAT was formed, there was an amalgam of civil law principles and common law principles. So therefore today, please don't let anyone silence you by quoting European Court of Judgment interpretations in GST. Please don't entertain ECJ VAT judgments as if it is directly throwing light on GST law, because GST law does not follow European continental civil law principles. GST continues to rely on sale from Sale of Goods Act, barter from Transfer of Property Act, exchange from Transfer of Property Act, lease, license. All of these transactions flow from our laws, which are based on English common law. So please be very careful. Now when you look at Chappell versus Nestle, consideration is the sum total of all of these things. What is consideration? Therefore, what is it that as a seller I require to part with my goods or services? You give me somebody else give me something else. I want all of that. If I don't get all of that, I will not even sell anything to anybody. Then the sum total of all of that is the consideration. Is consideration total money paid by buyer or total money received by seller? You will understand and appreciate that consideration is total money received by seller is the consideration, even if only part of that is paid by the buyer. Two other judgments I want to introduce to you before getting into credit, input tax credit principles. When there was a judgment in Thorson Car Ferries, where they said if this, when uh, supply for free is a weak defense. Supply for free is a weak defense. This is what I said in Thorson Car Ferries. Keep in mind. Second, in Woodhouse AC Cocoa Limited, it was said that a businessman knows his business best. A businessman knows his business best even if he claims to be indulging somebody for nothing in return. So please keep in mind, when a businessman says he is giving something for free, please doubt that statement. He may mean that he is not collecting money for it. But you know GST law does not wait for money only to come. It can wait, it will be sufficiently happy if any consideration is flowing for giving this in response to, in respect of, in response to, or for the inducement of. These are the words used in 231A and B. Whatever makes me willing to supply, all of that becomes the consideration. So please keep in mind, can you think of anybody giving anything for free? Will a pharmaceutical company give medicines to the doctor for free? If they really want to give it as a charity, they should give it to patient, not to doctor. They know what they are getting in return for giving it to the doctor. Will anyone give soap for free? Will airline give water for free? Please bear in mind, it's all built into the ticket price. So you need to be very careful. When you see something as free, you cannot blindly accept it. One quick point and we will move on. When something is stated to be given for free, please examine, is it enforceable or not? Can you force them? You said you're giving it for free, please give it to me. I will take you to court and ask the court to direct you to give it to me for free. Court will not say, I will not enforce this. But if you see that it is enforceable based on the terms of the contract, then it will not be free and it will have a consideration. Sir, but I have already reversed the ITC thinking it is free. Is it sufficient? Absolutely not. We will go to the provisions on credit and then cover some of those aspects. If some questions, maybe one or two questions we will take and then quickly get into credit. Any questions, please, on credit, on valuation? All right. We short on time, so maybe we'll wait for questions to come in later. We'll quickly get into input tax credit, some of the unresolved issues, so to speak, in input tax credit, and maintain continuity with what we're talking about. As you know, Section 17(5)(h) very clearly says goods lost, stolen, destroyed, written off, or disposed of by way of gift or free sample, input credit should be reversed. Please keep in mind, we are all seeing the word gift in section 17(5)(h) and are very happy to reverse the credit. Please read the words before the word gift. What it says, disposed by way of gift or free sample. Giving as a gift or giving as a free sample is a way of disposing only. What will you dispose? Will you dispose goods that are fit for sale or will you dispose goods that are unfit for sale? Will you dispose goods that are fit for sale or will you dispose goods that are unfit for sale? You know how the word disposal is understood. Disposal, as you know, is used in 3 main places in GST. Total 11 places the word disposal is used. But 3 places is 7(1)(a), Para 1, Schedule 1 and 17(5)(h). In Para 1, Schedule 1 it says, disposal of business assets on which input credit is claimed, which means if you are disposing a business asset and you are not reversing the credit, then it will be a supply under schedule 1. But if you are paying tax as a disposal of business asset under schedule 1, then there is no requirement for you to reverse the credit. So please bear in mind that is a correlation between disposal in 71A para 1 schedule 1 and 17.5H. Next, keep in mind all sample is not disposal. Please test. Disposal is only of goods that are unfit for sale. Medicines given by pharmaceutical company to doctor is not unfit for sale. It is not meant for sale, but it is fit for sale. Unfit for sale means article that is lacking merchantable quality. You know, from Sale of Goods Act concept, you understand what is merchantable quality. It is lacking merchantable quality. It is physically lacking merchantable quality or legally lacking merchantable quality. For example, medicine which is expired in this month, is it physically lacking merchantable quality? No. It may be curing the condition if it is consumed today, but legally it is lacking merchantable quality because it is expiring this month. Another aspect of merchantability, one is unfit for sale, another is the unfitness that can come about is because of the quantity. Sometimes, you know, small testers of shampoo, perfume, it is sold in such small quantities that even one time it cannot be used. It is supplied in such a non-commercial quantity that it can also be treated as unfit for sale. So please keep in mind, disposal always takes place in the case of things that are unfit for sale and not that is fit for sale. Please don't reverse credit thinking it is a gift. Please note that it may be a supply attracting output tax, and we are under the misinformation reversing credit. If I reverse credit, can I refuse to pay output tax? Input tax, friends, as you know, is a right as explained in Eicher Motors 106 ELT3. It is a right that I have, that I voluntarily need to take. Input tax credit is a right that is available for me to take according to my wishes. My wishes has a time limit. I cannot say whenever I decide to wake up I will come and take it. The law says that there is a time limit. Is it possible for the input tax credit which I have paid to my supplier to vanish? Yes, it is possible. And for that we may not have time to go into it. I just leave this thought with you. Please read section 25 and section 27 of Limitations Act 1963 to understand what is the concept of prescription. Once you recognize what is a prescription, you will know that input tax credit is a right, but that right is attached with a prescription. If you don't take the right, that right can be taken away. That is the principle in GST. To take the right, there are number of preconditions and post conditions. One of the most important precondition is 16.1 says every registered person, which means if you are not registered, you will not get the credit. If you are registered but due to non-compliance with returns, they have cancelled your registration, then you become an unregistered person and you will not get the credit. But if the registration which is cancelled is restored, then the restoration has the effect of keeping your registration unbroken, then you will still get the credit. So please look at this as a precondition registration. What are the other preconditions? Section 16.2 contains 4 preconditions. You must have the invoice, you must have received the goods or the services, your supplier should have paid the tax to the department, and you should have shown the credit in the return. But this is a precondition. How can you make me responsible for things that are not in my control? Please bear in mind, this is the terms of the scheme. You like it, you follow it. You don't like it, you forfeit the credit and you can go. Now members have this question. Is it fair? Is it unfair? I would like to leave you with this thought that please separate the reason for this provision being unfair. Is it ethically not correct? The ethics of GST and the law of GST. If the law of GST is uniformly followed for everybody, there is no illegality. Because remember, this is not drafted by the rules. This is there in the act itself, and Parliament can be presumed to understand the law existing as on that day. Please look at in November 2019 CA Journal. There's a very nice article written by one of our members about this concept of Section 30, Rule 36(4), where he is looking at this principle which is relevant in 16(2)(c) context also, and he says there is this judgment in 45 VST, 45 VST in Punjab High Court's case, where they said it is a impossible eventuality. What? Making the recipient of the supply lose the credit because the supplier defaulted in paying tax to the department. The Punjab High Court said it is a impossible eventuality. Later that judgment came to be upheld in Arise India judgment by Delhi High Court in 2015, talking about this concept, saying that it is an impossible eventuality. How can you make the deny input tax credit just because the supplier has defaulted? But I would only submit there are a few people who grasp the concept of constitutional law, and I would wait for them to challenge this provision in the courts. But today, more than 2 years have passed since GST is introduced. 16(4) has played its part in our businesses. So please, instead of struggling with the ethics of GST law and mixing it with the law of GST, let us separate the two. If it's a question of ethics, there's a different forum to raise that issue. If it is a law, we will have to deal with this on an everyday basis. I think that this provision is deliberately inserted in the law. I don't think there is any impossible eventuality that is unconscionable. That is the terms of the scheme. The buyer and the seller can make sure quantity is correctly delivered, rate is correctly charged, bill is correctly issued, bill is correctly paid. Everyone can look after everything, except nobody can look after whether GST was paid to the department or not. Please be very careful when you take such stand that there is a excessive legislation going on here, or arbitrariness in the legislation going on here. When you look at these aspects, I would also urge you to please consider the GST law not only gives the right, it will strip the taxpayer of the right also if he fails to satisfy certain post conditions. What are the post conditions? Payment within time. You have to pay within time. Rule 137. If you reverse because you did not pay within time, then there is now no time limit to take back this reversal whenever you do make the payment. So that relief is there. Other provisions are that when you write off the creditor's balances, write back the creditor's balances, whether you should reverse the credit. When you write back a creditor, obviously it means it is a decision not to pay. Please examine two parts to this. Many contractual arrangements always have bilateral treatment. Customer will treat the transaction in one way in the books, and the supplier will treat in the mirror way in his books. But many transactions in the accounts are not bilateral but unilateral. For example, write-off of debtors is a unilateral treatment. I don't have to ask my debtor before writing off the dues from him. Write back of creditors, it is a unilateral treatment. When you look at unilateral treatments, please be very careful whether conditions linked to this have also been satisfied or not. Many times nowadays we find that Senvat credit, it was taken under the earlier law, utilized or carried forward. Today those goods are lost. What should we do? Can we reverse CGST, SGST? Please bear in mind, there are some conditions that are attached with claiming credit. Conditions are that you must use it in the course of furtherance of the Senvat rules also. Now, if I don't use some goods on which excise duty was paid and taken credit, today if I don't use it, I have to pay back the excise duty and I cannot pay back GST today. I may be allowed to pay excise duty out of my CGST balance, but what I am paying is not CGST, but I am paying back excise duty. Like this, if you identify pre and post conditions, I suppose the deliberate intention of the government in coming out with this law in this condition, shape and situation will become more acceptable, and therefore we will not have confusion due to mixing of ethics of the law with the way the law has actually been implemented. Another aspect to kindly to look at it from this point of view is when you are looking at reversal of common credits, two aspects I will share and conclude and open up for some questions. Two aspects to consider is I have to reverse common credits. I know a lot of members have this struggle when you look at common credits, how to reverse the common credit. Someone says, I in the month of March, some shares were sold. Now, since I have sold shares and the value at which I have sold the shares, 1% is treated as an exempt supply under 17.3, do I have to reverse common credits? You have to reverse common credits, but my question is, what are your common credits? If you can sufficiently examine your business such that T1, T2, T3, everything is taken care of properly and T4 is zero, then there may not be anything to reverse. Are you complying with 17.2? Yes, I am complying with 17.2. But exempt turnover by total turnover into zero should be your goal. Please find a way to optimize your common credits because it is possible for you to leave your share trading activity in the premises which is not the factory premises so that the rent of the factory does not become a common credit. Please look into your credit optimization so that you don't suffer adverse formula. Please be very careful how you will reverse these credits. Another last illustration I want to leave with you, it came up from one of our discussions with Siddharth on this aspect. Please keep in mind there is two words that we see in section 16.1. We know about reversal of common credits under 17.2. We know about reversal of credits under 17.5. I'm leaving issues like motor vehicle, construction, immovable property reversals under 17.5 because it may be part of the questions itself that some members may have. I also want to share with you one point that there are three hurdles in input tax credit scheme. 17.5 is the third hurdle, 17.2 is the second hurdle, 16.1 itself is a hurdle. Please bear in mind, intended to be used is sufficient to take credit provisionally, but ultimately it must be used. If it is not used, in para 4b and 4a and 4b of second schedule where they are talking about no used for other purpose, diverted for private purpose. So therefore 16.1 is also a hurdle. If you do not cross 16.1, you will still not get the credit even if 17.2 and 17.5 are allowing us to take the credit. Please look at it from the point of view whether you have crossed the hurdle of 16.1. I give you this example. Since input tax credit, suppose I have a furniture business in Dharwad and a software development business in Bangalore and I have a single GST number, I am not barred from using the surplus credit in Dharwad to pay the output tax in Bangalore or the surplus credit in Bangalore to use it to pay output tax in Dharwad. But question is, when I have taken credit in Bangalore, is that inward supply finally used in an outward supply or not? The credit of Bangalore may get used up in Dharwad, but is the inward supply from which that credit is originating, did it get ultimately used in the course or furtherance of business? If you look at a parallel in income tax, you will find that if the Dharwad business is a loss and Bangalore business is a profit, in income tax, the loss of the Dharwad business can be set off against the profit of the Bangalore business in that year to arrive at finally what is the profit under the head income from business or profession. But that does not work the same way in GST. I hope I have been able to bring out some of the unresolved issues in supply, valuation, input tax credit, and I'm sure that I'm not yet capable of resolving all these issues, but certainly I hope to have contributed in adding some perspective, some more points of further inquiry that members can go into to find answers that we all are struggling with to come to take a decision to be implemented without the luxury of court judgments because this is a new law. I thank KSCA for giving me this opportunity and all of you for your participation during this lockdown period. I hope things are safe with everyone and your families, and I hand over to the moderator for sharing some questions. Thank you very much. While we are waiting for the moderator, I will bring up a couple of questions. Whether